bucket of history is never cleared in one sitting. We left the regulators mid-testimony, their names echoing from the witness stand, their actions scrawled in the margins of law and blood. We spoke of Dick Brewer, the foreman turned captain who carried a badge one day and fell to the bullet the next. We weighed Charlie Bowdry, the cheesemaker who chose loyalty over peace, and Frank McNabb, the cattle detective who lived by pursuit and died in an ambush. We closed with Josiah Gordon Doc Scurlock, the philosopher with a revolver, a man stitched together words and wounds in equal measure. Their cases have been heard, their verdicts recorded. But the regulators were not a trio, nor a quartet. They were a fraternity, rough, restless, bound together by the murder of John Tunstall and the collapse of law in Lincoln County. Their roll call stretches further. Henry Newton Brown, restless gunman and reluctant lawman. Fred Waite, the Chickasaw who rode for justice in a land that gave him none. John Middleton, torn by bullets and fever, yet remembered for his grit. George and Frank Coe, cousins who stood with Billy until the smoke blinded one for life. Jim French, a shadow on the battlefield, his fate as murky as the desert dusk. And Yginio Salazar, the youth who bled beside Billy, carrying scars that spoke louder than words. Each name, each story is a case in itself. Some found redemption, some found graves, and others simply vanished into the shifting dust of the frontier. Yet together, they remind us that the Lincoln County War was not Billy the Kid's tale alone. It was a chorus of voices, rising and falling in a courtroom where justice itself was on trial. Today, those voices return to the stand. Their testimony begins anew. Hey, Angela, how's it going?
Hey, John, it's all right. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I mean, it's a bit of a stressful, chaotic existence I got going right now, so
yeah.
I know as far as keeping up with our regular schedule, I'm doing the best I can.
Through it.
But so, I'm doing the best that I possibly can, but it just is what it is. I mean, there's just nothing I can do about it at this point.
Well, we're trucking along, so it happens as it happens.
Yeah, that's
the way it's supposed to happen.
Pretty much how it is, and there's no other way to do it, so there you have it. But we're ready for this new segment into our Gallows and Gunfights.
We actually better be, because I'm getting people asking me, where's part 2?
Yeah, this one seems like people are enjoying this, which is cool. That's exciting to me. So
yeah, my history-loving people are like, where's part 2?
Yeah.
And by the way, the trouble I got in last time for having not seen Young Guns has rained down upon me from other avenues as well. So, oh yeah. Other people are angry with me for it. Not as bad as that I haven't seen Forrest Gump, but probably all of the listeners are ripping their hair out now. I will watch Young Guns. It is in the works.
So we haven't rectified that issue.
I have not, because now I've been told I'm not allowed to watch it alone.
Oh.
By all the people who love it, and will probably, and I'm going to call them out, will probably ruin it for me, because they're going to recite the whole damn movie.
You didn't do what I do?
Well, I do it too, but not when there's a newbie watching,
Right.
And I know that I've seen it, but like I said, I was probably young, I was probably coloring, I probably didn't care.
Right. Yeah.
So,
well, as long as it's in the works, I highly recommend it.
I'm going to throw some duct tape over some mouths and let them sit there and watch it with me, but
you might have to do that.
They don't get to talk.
All right. Well, shall we jump in?
Let's jump in.
Okay. Well, welcome listeners back to Dark Dot Gallows and Gunfights, the show where the Old West takes the witness stand and the myths are cross-examined under oath.
This isn't the Hollywood version with black hats and white hats. This is the West as it lived, bloody, corrupt, and tilled. And today, the gallery is still full. Regulators are about to be called back to testify.
Exactly. When Tunstall was murdered, the Regulators weren't just names on a roster. They were young men who swore an oath to defend him, then watched the law itself turn against them. Deputies 1 week, fugitives the next. Each of them carried their own story with their own contradictions. Lawman and outlaw, sometimes living in the same skin.
And that's what makes their testimonies so gripping. Because behind every familiar name like Billy the Kid were men like Henry Newton Brown, Fred Waite, John Middleton, the Coes, Jim French, and I knew you were going to make me say that guy's name. Yginio Salazar?
Yginio, I think.
But it looks like my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. My parents. Anyway, some found redemption, some were broken by the war, and others slipped into legend or obscurity.
So if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you find us, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with someone who loves real history told without the varnish. Your support keeps the courtroom open and the cases rolling.
Because these aren't just stories about gunfights. They're about power, loyalty, betrayal, and the fragile line between law and lawlessness.
And with that, court is in session once again. The Regulators take the stand. So as we learned in the last episode, Doc Scurlock laid down his guns and found peace, but not every regulator could escape the orbit of blood and retribution. Some were chained to violence, pulled back into it no matter how far they tried to ride. One of those men was Henry Newton Brown, orphan, gunman, lawman, and outlaw. His life was a pendulum swing between order and chaos, ending with a noose and a bullet in a Kansas town square. The charge? A restless soul of the frontier who traded one badge for another and paid for it in blood. Henry Newton Brown was born in 1857 near Rolla, Missouri, orphaned young and raised by relatives. Like many boys with no roots, he looked west. By his teens, he was a cowboy on the Texas plains, hunting buffalo, drifting from herd to herd, learning the habits of the saddle and the rifle. Somewhere in those years, a gunfight claimed a man's life at his hand. The details are scarce, but it was the first sign that Brown's life would be measured in violence. In 1876, he rode into New Mexico territory. He worked first for the L.G. Murphy Company, the very empire that dominated Lincoln County, and then for John Chisholm, the Pecos cattle king. Eventually, Brown took wages under John Tunstall, herding cattle on the Rio Feliz Ranch and forging relationships with men who would become regulators: George Coe, Charlie Bowdry, Billy the Kid. When Tunstall was ambushed and killed in February of 1878, Brown stood ready with the rest. He was among the first to ride with the Regulators, sworn in under Dick Brewer to avenge their murdered employer. Brown's name appears in the most infamous actions of the war, including the execution of William Morton and Frank Baker, along with the shooting of William McCloskey, the ambush of Sheriff William Brady and Deputy George Hinman, where he rode alongside Billy the Kid, Jim French, Frank McNabb, and others, guns blazing, papers and rifles stripped from Brady's corpse. The fight at Blazer's Mill, where Buckshot Robert killed Brewer and wounded several Regulators before going down himself, and the 5-day Battle of Lincoln, July 1878, where Brown helped hold McSween's burning house until escape was the only option. By the war's end, Brown carried murder warrants like unwanted badges. He drifted with Billy the Kid for a time, rustling and raiding, but the lawless cycle had worn him thin. He made a choice Billy never could. He left New Mexico and he sought a different life. Brown's trail carried him to Texas and then to Caldwell, Kansas, where the outlaw became lawman. He served first as deputy sheriff, then as assistant marshal, and finally as city marshal of Caldwell, a cow town as rough as any in the West. And here, for a time, Henry Newton Brown thrived. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't waste his wages in saloons, He wore his badge with discipline. Citizens praised him for his sobriety and efficiency, calling him a man who kept the streets safe when the trail herds poured in. In 1883, Brown shot and killed 2 outlaws in a daylight gunfight. Proving his mettle, grateful town folks presented him with an engraved Winchester rifle. For once, he seemed settled, respected, and even admired. But the pendulum swung back. On April 30th, 1884, Brown, now 27 years old, betrayed the trust that he'd earned. He led his deputy, Ben Wheeler, along with Billy Smith and John Wesley, in an attempted bank robbery at Medicine Lodge, Kansas. It went bad. The robbers were trapped, the bank president was shot dead, and within hours, Brown and his gang were captured. The lawman who had been celebrated as Caldwell's savior was now in disgrace. That night, vigilante justice returned the favor. A mob stormed the jail, shooting Brown as he tried to escape, and then hanging his corpse and riddling it with bullets. The man who had worn a badge and outlaw's gun ended his life the way that he had lived it, violently, without mercy. The verdict of time? Henry Newton's Brown life is a cautionary tale written in dust and gunpowder. He fought beside Billy the Kid, then wore the star of a marshal. He was both regulator and lawman, both protector and predator. In the end, he couldn't outrun the violence that defined him. Henry Newton Brown's life swung between lawman and outlaw, ending in betrayal and lynch mob justice. But if Brown was a cautionary tale, then Tom O'Phalliard was the heart, Billy the Kid's closest friend, a young man who sang through the smoke and fought through the fire, and who stayed loyal right up to the day Pat Garrett's bullet struck him down. So before we jump into Tom O'Phalliard, I do have to say, Tom O'Phalliard shows up in Young Guns 2 as this, like, really meek and kind of a pansy-ass kid that, you know, Billy basically invited into the gang because he just needed warm bodies to fill those slots. And that shit was all made up. That was all Hollywood. As a matter of fact, this kid that in Young Guns 2 called Billy the Prince of Pistoliers. Unfortunately, that was absolute bullshit. This was actually Billy the Kid's very best friend. He was not a little pansy-ass kid that was trying to chase Billy because now he was famous. They were best friends.
Okay.
So I just wanted to make it very clear. Like I said, Young Guns 1 is very historically accurate for the most part. Young Guns 2 takes a lot of liberties and just makes shit up that just simply did not happen at all.
Sequels are never as good as the first.
Never. But, you know, it's just so interesting to me because as you know, we're learning as we move through this, the whole story of Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War is so full of just great battles and shit that actually happened. It's just so strange that they got to make this stuff up.
Yeah.
And, you know, where you're talking about like this guy, Tom O'Phalliard, I mean, why make him this dumbass stuttering little kid that's basically starstruck by Billy the Kid? It just, it doesn't make sense.
He was the first fanboy.
Yeah, that's exactly how they make it appear. Yes. All right. So talking about Tom O'Phalliard, the charge, loyalty to the wrong man and the wrong cause, a devotion that ended with a grave beside Billy the Kid. Tom O'Phalliard was born in 1858 in Uvalde, Texas. In a frontier family always on the move, his parents, Tom Sr. and Sarah Cook, drifted like so many others after the Civil War into Coahuila, Mexico for a spell, and then back across the border into Texas. Tom grew up shuffling between relatives, raised at different times by his grandmother and an uncle. He was no hardened outlaw in youth. By most accounts, Tom was cheerful, good-natured, and musical. He loved to sing and lift the mood of those around him. But In a world where family ties often frayed and survival depended on the company that you kept, Tom went looking for belonging. At 19, in May of 1878, Tom and his friend James Woodland headed west into New Mexico territory. For a time, he may have worked under the vast cattle empire of John Chisholm, the Pecos Valley cattle king. But destiny and trouble soon pulled him into the orbit of Billy the Kid. Tom arrived in Lincoln County as it burned with fractional violence. The murder of John Tunstall had already sent shockwaves through the territory. By June of 1878, Tom was guarding Tunstall's horses alongside Billy the Kid, Charlie Bowdry, Henry Newton Brown, and Doc Scurlock. It was here that Tom joined the Regulators. He rode through the skirmishes, ambush, and the raids, but his defining trial came during the 5-day battle in July of 1878. Trapped with the Regulators in McSween's house as Dolan's men surrounded it, Tom fought to hold the line. When the house was set ablaze, he escaped through the gunfire and smoke, wounded in the shoulder but alive. Susan McSween later remembered Tom for his liveliness amid the Regulators. While others carried grim faces, Tom cracked jokes, sang tunes, and brought a kind of levity to men half broken by loss. When the war sputtered out in blood and ash, most Regulators scattered, but Tom stayed. If Billy the Kid was the legend, Tom was his shadow, confidant, and partner. Together, they formed the Bonnie Gang. Tom, Billy, Charlie Bowdry, Dave Rudabaugh, Tom Pickett, and Billy Wilson. They rustled cattle across the Pecos, fought running skirmishes with sheriffs and posses, and lived hand-to-mouth in the scrubland of the southeast New Mexico and West Texas. Tom's loyalty was ironclad. He shared Billy's hardships, his narrow escapes, and his fugitive laughter. Unlike some of the Kid's companions, Tom wasn't chasing infamy. He was following a friend. By late 1880, the noose was tightening. Sheriff Pat Garrett had sworn to bring Billy down, and his posse hunted the Bonnie Gang relentlessly. On December the 19th, 1880, they cornered the outlaws near Fort Sumner. Tom stepped out to tend the horses and was caught in a crossfire. A bullet tore through his chest. Carried inside, he lingered for about 45 minutes. Witnesses said that he never cursed, never cried out, just breathed shallow and stared into the dark until death claimed him. He was buried at Old Fort Sumner Cemetery alongside his comrades Charlie Bowdry and, within months, Billy the Kid himself. Tom O'Phalliard was no notorious outlaw, no calculating leader. He was remembered instead for loyalty, cheer, and courage. In a time where friendships were fleeting and alliances bought with coin, Tom gave Billy the Kid something rarer, companionship that didn't falter. The verdict of history? Tom O'Phalliard died because he stayed true to his friend, to his chosen family, to a cause that could never last. But in the gallows ledger of the Old West, he is remembered not as a killer, but as Billy the Kid's most faithful friend. Tom O'Phalliard's loyalty made him Billy the Kid's shadow, but loyalty ran even deeper among blood kin. George and Frank Coe, cousins, ranchers, Regulators, stood shoulder to shoulder in the feud that tore Lincoln County apart. Their story isn't just one of bullets and ambushes, but of survival, testimony, and the uneasy conscience of men who lived long enough to remember. The charge? Frontier fighters who crossed the line between vigilante and outlaw and lived long enough to tell the jury of history their side of the story. George Coe came west from Brighton, Iowa in 1871 with his cousin Frank, chasing the promise of land and stock near Fort Stanton. They cut their teeth in the brutal economy of rustling and reprisal, riding with Doc Scurlock, Charlie Bowdry, and Ab Sanders. In 1876, George had already participated in frontier justice, storming the Lincoln jail to lynch Jesus Largo and gunning down rustler Nikos Maras in the Baca Canyon. There were the rules of the frontier: written in blood and iron. When the Lincoln County War erupted, George was swept in after an arrest by Sheriff William Brady. He threw in with the Regulators, siding with McSween and Tunstall against Murphy and Dolan's monopoly. George fought at Blazer's Mill, where a bullet cost him his trigger finger. He rode in the 5-day battle and later shot and wounded Seven Rivers warrior Dutch Charlie Kruling in revenge for Frank McNabb's murder. Unlike many comrades, George survived until old age. He claimed amnesty, built a ranch, and prospered. His memoir, Frontier Fighter, published in 1934, remains one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the Lincoln County War. Though even he admitted memory had blurred into legend, he lived until 1941, dying at 84, the last Regulator to give the world his version of truth. Older cousin Frank Coe was born in Virginia, grew up in West Virginia, and struck west with George in 1871. He worked as a buffalo hunter before settling near the Rio Hondo, where the cousins tried ranching. Like George, Frank joined in with early vigilante raids, the lynching of Jesus Largo and the killing of Nikos Maras. When the war broke out, Frank was squarely with McSween and Tunstall. At Blazer's Mill, he tried to parley with Buckshot Roberts, urging him to surrender. Minutes later, the shooting began, and Roberts was killed. George's bullet may have done the work, though stories differ. On April 29, 1878, Frank rode with McNabb and Saunders near the Fritz Ranch. McNabb was ambushed and killed, Saunders wounded, and Frank captured by Jesse Evans' posse. He escaped soon after, another narrow brush with death in a season full of them. Frank also fought in the 5-day Battle of Lincoln. He abandoned his post at the Ellis House when Colonel Dudley's artillery made it clear that the Regulators were outgunned. After the war, he drifted to Colorado, then back to New Mexico, where he was mistakenly arrested for murder, with authorities confusing him with his cousin George. He married Helena Ann Tooley in 1881, built a ranch on the Ruidoso, and lived quietly until dying of pneumonia in 1931. George and Frank Coe were cut from the same cloth. Ranchers, Regulators, survivors, they carried rifles for justice when the courts failed, but they also proved that men who took up the gun could, in time, lay it down. Where Billy, Bowdry, O'Fallard, and Brewer ended in graves, the Coes lived on, raising cattle, building families, and eventually setting pen to paper. Their voices, especially George's memoir, gave historians a window into the war. Their survival complicates the tale. Not every Regulator was doomed. Some rode out of the smoke, older, quieter, but still carrying the weight of what they'd done. The Coe cousins survived the war and settled into the quiet life of ranching, but one Regulator took a stranger path. Fred Waite, Chickasaw by blood, educated, literate, worldly, carried a rifle for Billy the Kid, then went home to become a lawmaker. In a saga where most men ended in the ground, Waite ended in government. The charge? Gunman turned statesman, a frontier fighter who traded ambush for legislation. Fred Waite was born September 23, 1853, at Fort Arbuckle, Indian Territory, which would be present-day Oklahoma. He was the eldest of 10 children. His father, Thomas Fletcher Waite, was a Chickasaw farmer and trader who valued hard work and self-sufficiency. Unlike many on the frontier, Fred was educated. He studied at Illinois Industrial University and later at Mound City Commercial College in St. Louis, where he learned business and law. For a time, he ran his family's store, but restlessness drove him west. By 1875, Waite had drifted into New Mexico, finding work with John Chisholm and then later John Tunstall, whose murder would draw Waite into a war that seemed a world apart from his upbringing. When John Tunstall was ambushed and killed in February 1878, Fred Waite was one of the cowboys who swore vengeance. Deputized by Justice of the Peace John Wilson, Waite joined the newly formed Regulators. At first, their work carried the veneer of legality, serving warrants on Tunstall's killers, but as territorial politics stripped them of that authority, they became what history remembers: vigilantes hunted as outlaws. Fred Waite was in the thick of it. April 1st of 1878, he rode in the ambush of Sheriff Brady and Deputy George Hinman. Some say his rifle cracked shots that morning. Others remember him as part of the covering fire. Either way, his name went into the indictments. Blazer's Mill, he faced down Buckshot Roberts, the lone gunman who killed leader Dick Brewer and nearly destroyed the Regulators in one afternoon of lead and blood. July 1878, the 5-day battle. Waite was among those trapped in the McSween's burning house, firing through smoke and flame until the Regulators cut their way out. He escaped alongside Billy the Kid, sprinting through chaos and gunfire into legend. For this, Waite earned $4 or $5 a day. Better pay than most cowhands ever saw, but the cost was high. Wanted posters, indictments, and the stain of murder on his name. In 1880, Frank Waite knew the outlaw's life was a dead end. He left New Mexico behind and went home to Indian Territory, where he remade himself. He married Mary Elise Thompson, built a ranch, raised a family, and turned his energy towards service rather than survival. Waite entered Chickasaw politics. He served multiple terms in the legislature, including 3 sessions as Speaker of the House. Later, he became Attorney General of the Chickasaw Nation, championing rule of law and improved governance for his people. Where many of his old Regulator comrades hung, O'Fallard, Bowdry, Brewer, Waite found a second act. He lived by principle, earning a reputation for honesty and integrity. Fred Waite died September the 24th, 1895 in Pauls Valley, Oklahoma, just a day after his 42nd birthday. Buried among his people, his grave marks one of the strangest trajectories of the Lincoln County War, from outlaw ambushes in New Mexico to the halls of a Chickasaw government. In the gallery of Regulators, Waite stands out, not for being the fastest gun or the fiercest fighter, but for being the rare man who laid his gun down and built something lasting. His life is proof that even amid the chaos of the Old West, redemption was possible. As is obvious, I think at this point, none of these guys are included in Young Guns, either 1 or 2. And so there's a shit ton of people that just get left out of the story.
Obvious to some people.
You know, I mean, and again, I don't really understand it. I guess it makes it more glamorous to think that it was like a group of, maybe 10 guys total. But in reality, it was a hell of a lot bigger than that. It was a full-on freaking war.
Well, and they cut it down because they don't want to spend all that time introducing all the characters.
And I understand that, but you would think, I mean, they could do it without like telling who they are.
Yeah.
And they could have a group of just cowboys that are participating, but the core group, whoever you pick, are the ones. But no, they just choose to make it seem like it's these few guys. And
you don't matter. How rude.
Yeah, exactly. So Fred Waite walked away from the war and built a second life in politics, but not every Regulator had that chance. Some stayed bound to the gun, their lives measured in scars and gunpowder. John Middleton was one of those men, loyal to Tunstall, inseparable from Billy the Kid, and remembered less for surviving than for fighting until the West itself swallowed him. The charge? Fighter, outlaw, and survivor of bullet wounds that would have killed most men, yet a man who never outrun the shadow of the Lincoln County War. John Middleton was born around 1854, either in Tennessee or in Texas. Little survives of his youth except whispers that he fled his home country after a deadly quarrel left a man dead. By the early 1870s, he had drifted west into New Mexico territory. Heavy-set, swarthy, With black eyes under a thick mustache, Middleton earned his keep as a cowboy. By the mid-1870s, he was riding for John Tunstall's Rio Feliz ranch. Middleton wasn't just another ranch hand. He was a brawler, a sharpshooter, and a man others looked to when steel nerves and a steady trigger were required. When John Tunstall was gunned down on February 18, 1878, Middleton was there. He helped recover Tunstall's body, and grief hardened into rage. That same night, Middleton joined the corps of riders who became the Regulators, sworn to avenge their murdered employer and bring his killers to justice. From that moment on, Middleton was in every major clash of the war. Morton and Baker's capture on March 9, 1878. Middleton rode with Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, and others to arrest Morton and Baker, accused in Tunstall's death. Both men were killed on the trail under murky circumstances. Middleton's hand in their deaths is debated, but his gun was certainly present when justice turned into blood. The ambush of Sheriff Brady, April 1st of 1878. Middleton crouched alongside Billy the Kid, Jim French, and Frank McNabb in the dust of Lincoln's main street. Their volley cut down Sheriff William Brady and Deputy George Hinman in broad daylight. Brady was riddled with more than a dozen bullets. Middleton was indicted for murder, forever branded an outlaw in the eyes of the law. The gunfight at Blazer's Mill on April 4th, 1878, Middleton faced Buckshot Roberts, a one-man army who stood off the Regulators. A bullet tore through Middleton's chest, ripping him open and nearly killing him. While Dick Brewer fell dead in the fight, Middleton somehow lived, though the wound would haunt him for the rest of his short life. The 5-day battle, July of 1878, Middleton was holed up with Doc Scurlock, the Coe cousins, Charlie Bowdry, and others in the Ellis house, exchanging rifle fire across the streets of Lincoln while McSween's home burned. He escaped under cover of night, another survivor marked by fire and lead. With indictments hanging over him and scars that never truly healed, Middleton left the Regulators. He drifted north into Texas and Kansas, hoping for peace. He married Maria H. Colcord, tried his hand at ranching, and even received money from John Tunstall's father as compensation for his service. For a time, it seemed like he might succeed where so many others failed, carving out a life beyond the feud. But fate had other plans. Accounts of his end are contradictory. Some say that he died of smallpox in San Lorenzo, New Mexico in 1882. Others claim that he succumbed to his old chest wound in Kansas in 1885. Either way, he was gone before age 35, another casualty of the war's relentless toll. John Middleton's story is written less in victories than in survival. He stood at Tunstall's side, rode with Billy the Kid, bled in Lincoln, and outlived many of his brothers in arms, only to fade into obscurity. For the people of Lincoln County, he was one of the hardest fighters of the Regulators, a man with fists as quick as his pistols, who carried his scars until the end. For us, his story shows what the Lincoln County War made of men: loyal cowboys turned killers, survivors who found no peace, shadows etched into the legend of the Kid. John Middleton left Lincoln carrying scars that would never heal, but some men didn't just survive the gunsmoke, they became part of it. Among the Regulators, none was more fearsome and none more mysterious than Jim French. Big, brooding, and dangerous, he appeared in Lincoln like a storm and vanished just as suddenly, leaving behind questions that historians still can't answer. The charge? Outlaw, gunman, enforcer of the Regulators' vengeance, and a ghost in the historical record. Almost nothing certain is known of Jim French's early life. Some say he hailed from Texas, others from the Deep South. There are suggestions that he may have been a mixed African-American or Native ancestry, a fact that, if true, made him stand out even more in Lincoln County, where ethnic tensions already simmered. What is clear is his presence. French was big, powerful, and volatile. He was quick to fight, quicker to shoot, and utterly loyal to his friends. In a world where reputation mattered as much as fact, French's sheer size and ferocity made him a man to be feared. No photograph survives of him, no solid record of his family or his death. He remains one of the greatest enigmas of the frontier. Jim French rode into legend alongside Billy the Kid, Dick Brewer, Charlie Bowdry, and the Coe cousins. From the moment John Tunstall was murdered in February of 1878, French took up the cause of vengeance. Blackwater Creek, March 9th, 1878. French was there when the Regulators captured William Morton and Frank Baker and William McCloskey. All three ended up dead, their bodies left in the dust. French's exact role is debated, but his gun was certainly part of the violence. The ambush of Sheriff Brady on April 1st, 1878. French helped plan and execute the attack that killed Brady and Hinman. After the gunfire, he and Billy the Kid broke cover to search Brady's body for documents and arrest warrants. In the exchange, French was seriously wounded by Deputy Bill Matthews. Friends smuggled him out of town, saving his life. Blazer's Mill on April 1st. Barely recovered, French fought in the gun battle with Buckshot Roberts.
April 4th.
What did I say?
First.
April 1st, April 4th. Oh, these dates, man. Now, April 4th, and was one of the bloodiest shootouts of the war. He survived, though Regulator leader, as we've talked about, Regulator leader Dick Brewer did not. And then obviously he was also part of the 5-day battle, and he was in the McSween house during that battle, trapped with Billy the Kid and the last Regulators. When Murphy Dolan gunmen demanded to see their legal authority, French shouted back, "Our warrants are in our guns, you sons of bitches." It was a defiant declaration that summed up the war itself. Law had failed and justice lived only at the barrel of a Winchester. As the flames closed in, French and Billy led the desperate escape, bolting through the gunfire while Alexander McSween was cut down in the yard. When the war sputtered out, Jim French disappeared almost as suddenly as he had arrived. Some say that he fled to Oklahoma Territory, lived quietly near Kyoto, and raised a family under another name. A handful of letters and family stories suggest that he survived into the 1890s. Others believe he died much earlier, gunned down on the trail, his body left unmarked and forgotten. The truth is still a mystery. French left no photographs, no gravestone, no clear ending. His story begins in Lincoln County with blood and fire, but it ends in silence. Among the Regulators, French was one of the fiercest. He was there in every major fight, from Brady's ambush to the burning of the McSween house. His loyalty to Billy the Kid was unquestioned. His willingness to shed blood was absolute. But it is the absence of answers that makes Jim French legendary. Who was he, really? Where did he go? Did he die on some forgotten trail or live out his days in quiet obscurity? What we do know is this. When the Regulators fought their deadliest battles, Jim French was always in the thick of it, roaring, bleeding, firing back until the smoke cleared. He was both a man of flesh and blood and a phantom whose story haunts the records of the Lincoln County War.
Helped you. It's pronounced Yginio.
Yginio?
Yginio.
Yginio.
E-G-I-N.
I would have never guessed that.
I just looked it up.
I would have never guessed that. Yginio.
Yginio.
Awesome. Well, thanks, because he's next. So
that's why I looked it up.
Jim French vanished into mystery, his trail swallowed by time. But another Regulator, one younger, quieter, and cut from a totally different cloth, lived to tell the tale. His name was Yginio Salazar. Unlike most of his brothers in arms, he did not vanish in a blaze of bullets or into the shadows of outlawry. He survived long enough to see his friendship with Billy the Kid etched on his tombstone, long enough to watch the legend grow around him. The charge? a young Hispano rancher drawn into the war for justice, scarred by gunfire yet destined to outlive the age of gunmen and walk as one of its last witnesses. Yginio Salazar was born on February the 14th, 1858. Some records say 1863.
It's kind of a gap.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy when you're looking back at these records and trying to figure this shit out, because some of it is like huge gaps.
Who's telling the truth?
Yeah, it's nuts. But he was born near the Hondo River in Valencia County, New Mexico Territory. He was the son of Teofilo and Paula Salazar. Raised in the rough rhythms of Hispano frontier life, his father died early and his mother remarried, moving the family close to Lincoln. He grew up in a large household, learning to ride, rope, and shoot with the ease of boys born in the saddle. But he was more than a ranch kid. He was also a fiddler, literate in English and Spanish, and a young man with both charm and grit. Those traits would later place him in the orbit of Billy the Kid. By his teens, Yginio had already crossed paths with the legendary outlaw to be. He was hired to play fiddle at a dance in Fort Stanton where Billy and other cowboys gathered. The two struck up a friendship that endured. Billy became something of a mentor, and Salazar admired him as bold, older brother figure. That bond would carry Salazar into the crucible of the Lincoln County War. When John Tunstall was murdered in February 1878, Salazar joined the Regulators. Though younger than most, he carried his weight in the saddle. His defining moment came during the 5-day battle in Lincoln in 1878. Alongside Billy the Kid, Jim French, Doc Scurlock, and the others, he was trapped in McSween's house, surrounded by Dolan's hired guns and Colonel Dudley's soldiers. When the attackers set the house ablaze, the Regulators made their desperate break. Yginio was shot in the back and in the shoulder, collapsing in the chaos. Playing dead as the smoke and gunfire raged, he waited until nightfall, crawled nearly a half a mile to his sister-in-law's house. There, Army surgeon Dr. Dan Apel treated his wounds. Against the odds, Yginio survived. Where most Regulators were killed, outlawed, or driven into exile, Salazar returned to the quiet life. He resumed ranching and farming near Lincoln, married Isabel Pena, something like that, and built a life of modest prosperity. Yet he never severed ties to Billy. During the kid's daring 1881 escape from jail, Salazar reportedly sheltered him briefly, feeding him and helping cut away his shackles before he fled once more into legend. Unlike Billy, Bowdry, O'Phalliard, and so many others, Yginio lived to see the turn of the century. He became a respected rancher, active in church and community life. He spoke both English and Spanish, straddling two cultures that often clashed in the territory. He lived long enough for journalists, historians, and storytellers to seek him out. His oral recollections became vital threads in reconstructing the Lincoln County War. Yginio Salazar died on January the 7th, 1936, buried in Lincoln Cemetery beside his wife. His gravestone bears the simple but unforgettable words, "Pal of Billy the Kid," which in Young Guns, at the end of Young Guns, they say that somebody broke in and inscribed the word "pal" on Billy's headstone. That never happened, but this did happen, which is likely where that comes from.
Okay.
So Salazar's story is singular. He was the lone Hispano Regulator to live out his life in peace, a bridge between cultures in a war often framed as Anglo versus Irish, and one of the last living links to Billy the Kid, carrying memories into the age of automobiles and radios. While others burned bright and died, Yginio endured. He turned away from outlawry, built a life, and let the world change around him. In doing so, he proved that survival could be its own kind of courage on the violent frontier. Yginio Salazar survived into old age, a living echo of the kid's legend, but For most of the Regulators, survival was measured in weeks or months, not in decades. They were young men bound together by blood, friendship, and loyalty. Never more so than in the case of Ab Saunders, cousin to the Coes and a steadfast brother in arms. If Billy the Kid was the spark, Saunders was the bedrock, steady, loyal, and scattered by the war that defined his short life. The charge? A rancher turned fighter who carried a bullet through his hip for the rest of his life and whose loyalty stitched together the heart of the Regulators. James Albert Ab Saunders was born October the 14th, 1851 in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, to James and Catherine Saunders. Like many frontier families, the Saunders clan sought opportunity further west. By the mid-1870s, Ab followed his cousins, Frank and George Coe, into Colfax County, New Mexico. Together, they carved out a ranch along the Rio Reduso. Life was harsh, but the cousins thrived with help from neighbors like Charlie Bowdry and Doc Scurlock. This tight-knit group soon became known for a brand of rough frontier justice. In 1876, they stormed Lincoln's jail to lynch Jesus Largo, a horse thief, and later tracked and killed wrestler Nikos Meras in the Baca Canyon. Saunders quickly earned a reputation as a steady hand and a loyal partner, qualities that would place him at the heart of the coming war. In 1877, when the young Englishman John Tunstall set up a rival ranch in Mercantile to challenge the Murphy-Dolan monopoly, Saunders and the Coes gravitated to his cause. They respected Tunstall's fairness in credit dealings and his willingness to back small ranchers against the house. When Tunstall was ambushed and murdered in February of 78 by Jesse Evans and his men, Saunders joined the Regulators, sworn in as a posse by Justice John B. Wilson to bring the killers to justice. His home became a meeting place for allies, and Billy the Kid often stayed with him, deepening bonds that would soon be tested in fire. As a Regulator, Saunders took part in nearly every major confrontation of the war's first month. The Blackwater killings, where he rode with Billy the Kid Brewer and others and captured and then executed Morton, Baker, and McCloskey. The Brady ambush in April of 78. The gunfight at Blazer's Mill, where Buckshot Roberts and Dick Brewer were killed. And the Fritz Ranch ambush on April 29, 1878. Traveling with Frank Coe and Frank McNabb, Saunders was ambushed by the Seven Rivers Warriors and the Jesse Evans gang. Led by Sheriff George Pepin, McNabb was killed, Coe was captured, and Saunders was shot through the hip, mistaken for Billy the Kid. He narrowly escaped execution, but would never fully recover from the wound. Too gravely injured to fight, Saunders missed the climactic 5-day Battle of Lincoln, watching from the margins as friends were killed or scattered. After the war, Saunders left New Mexico for El Paso, then Colorado, and finally California. But the bullet lodged in his hip never let him forget Lincoln. Years of pain led him to surgery in San Francisco in early 1883. Complications set in, and on February the 5th, 1883, at only 31 years old, Ab Saunders died. He was buried in Lompoc Evergreen Cemetery in California. He never married, and he left no descendants. Ab Saunders is remembered as a core member of the Regulators, bound by blood to the Coes and loyalty to Tunstall and Billy, a man whose rancher's sense of fairness pushed him to resist the house's monopoly. A fighter who carried the scars of the Lincoln County War to his grave. Though overshadowed by flashier figures, Saunders embodied the ironclad brotherhood that defined the Regulators. Men who fought not for fame, but for loyalty to each other and to a cause that they believed in. So the next one that we got to talk about is a little bit of an odd one, and he definitely does show up in Young Guns, and that is William McCloskey. So the charge is A man who rode with the Regulators, but whose conscience and his divided loyalties led to one of the most controversial deaths in the Lincoln County War. So William McCloskey remains one of the most shadowy figures of the Lincoln County conflict. Unlike Billy the Kid or the Coes, his life left little trace in the record. What we do know is that he drifted into Lincoln County in the years before 1878, finding work as a cowboy and a ranch hand. Quiet, unremarkable, and without kin or property to anchor him, McCloskey blended into the ranching community until violence dragged him into the spotlight. Unlike most of the Regulators, McCloskey's closest friend was not with Tunstall's cowboys, but with William Buck Morton, a man later accused of riding in the posse that gunned down John Tunstall. That bond would prove both defining and fatal. When Tunstall was murdered on February 18, 1878, McCloskey joined the hastily sworn Regulators. He rode beside Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, Frank McNabb, the Coes, all the rest of them, carrying a warrant for justice and perhaps for vengeance. But from the beginning, McCloskey stood apart. Where others burned with rage, he counseled restraint. When the Regulators finally cornered Morton and Baker in early March, after a running gun battle, McCloskey insisted the prisoners should be taken alive to Lincoln. A trial, he argued, was their only chance at legitimacy. Brewer agreed for the moment. And so, with the prisoners in tow, the Regulators began the long ride back. The journey to Lincoln was slow, tense, and punctuated by silence. Morton and Baker rode shackled under guard. McCloskey stayed close to Morton, speaking with him in low tones, trying to honor his promise of safe conduct. But as hours bled into days, suspicion poisoned the air. Other Regulators whispered that McCloskey's loyalty had wavered, that his friendship with Morton was clouding his judgment. Some believed he was feeding Morton information and even plotting to help the prisoners escape. Billy the Kid, restless and watchful, distrusted him. McNabb grew hard-eyed. Brewer, burdened with command, sensed mutiny on both sides of the saddle. By the time they reached Blackwater Creek on March 9, 1878, patience had run out. The accounts diverge, but the conclusion is the same. 3 men died that day. According to some versions, Morton tried to break free, Baker alongside him. In the chaos, McCloskey was shot down, possibly by Frank McNabb, others say by Billy himself. Executed not for treachery proven, but for loyalties doubted. Other tellings claim that there was no escape attempt at all, that Morton and Baker were simply executed and McCloskey, protesting too loudly, was silenced with a bullet of his own. His body lay near the men that he tried to shield, tangled in the dust and brush, a grim tableau of betrayal and vengeance. No trial, no evidence, just the smoke of gunfire and 3 corpses in a lonely stretch of New Mexican wilderness. William McCloskey is remembered not for what he did, but for what he may have done or refused to do. He rode into the Lincoln County War with the Regulators, but died by their hands, a victim of their paranoia, their rage, and their relentless pursuit of vengeance. His story is a reminder of the impossible choices facing men caught between law and loyalty in a land where both had broken down. McCloskey's death at Blackwater Creek marked the first time the Regulators killed one of their own, a fracture that revealed the cost of mistrust and the thin line between justice and murder on the frontier. And that brings us to another one that definitely does appear again in Young Guns, one of my very favorite characters in that movie, played by Lou Diamond Phillips, and that is Jose Chavez y Chavez. The charge? A man of 2 worlds, Apache and Spanish blood, who lived as constable, outlaw, regulator, and killer. Jose Chavez y Chavez walked the line between law and lawlessness and left behind a legend as conflicted as the frontier itself. Born in 1851 in Ceboleto, now Cebolleta, New Mexico Territory, Jose Chavez y Chavez inherited a heritage that both defined and divided him. His Spanish father linked him to the Hispano settlers, where he carved ranches and villages into the desert valleys. His Apache mother tied him to the native peoples whose land was being swallowed by cattle, soldiers, and mercantile monopolies. That dual lineage made him an outsider among Anglos, yet deeply rooted in New Mexico's cultural soil. By his 20s, he had carved out a role in his community. Elected constable of San Patricio in 1874, later serving as justice of the peace, he was young, literate, and respected for his composure in tense moments. He married Maria Lucero in 1871 and for a time looked to build a life anchored in family and civic service. But Lincoln County was no place for stability. Corruption, monopolies, and feuds poisoned its courts, and soon Chavez was drawn from lawman to fighter. When John Tunstall was murdered in February of 78, the outrage that swept the county reached even Chavez. Already disillusioned with Murphy and Dolan's economic stranglehold, he joined forces with Tunstall's lawyer, Alexander McSween, and the young cowboys who became the Regulators. Deputized under Justice of the Peace John Wilson, Chavez rode beside Billy the Kid, Dick Brewer, Frank McNabb, Jim French, Charlie Bowdry, and the Coes. For Chavez, this wasn't just about Tunstall. It was about resisting a system where the courts and sheriffs bent to the will of the House. And once he saddled up, he proved himself a fighter. Chavez rode at the heart of the Lincoln County War's most famous moments. In April 1st of 78, with the ambush of Brady and Hinman, Chavez claimed to have fired some of the shots that brought them down. Afterward, he and French rushed into the street to strip Brady of documents, nearly killed in the attempt. He was also at Blazer's Mill. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the Regulators in the fight that left Buckshot Roberts dead and Dick Brewer mortally wounded. In July of 1878, during the 5-day battle at Lincoln, Chavez was inside the burning McSween house as Dolan's men and Colonel Dudley's soldiers surrounded it. With bullets whipping through smoke, Chavez, Billy the Kid, Jim French fought their way out, escaping into the night while McSween was gunned down. In those desperate months, Chavez's courage was unquestionable. He was loyal, lethal, and for a time, an equal among men who lived and died by the gun. But like so many Regulators, the end of the war did not bring peace. Chavez drifted between law and crime. He sought re-election as Lincoln Constable in 1880, but failed after killing a prisoner in custody. He moved to Las Vegas, New Mexico, working as a deputy policeman, reportedly besting Bob Ford, the man who would later kill Jesse James in a shooting contest. Yet his badge was never far from blood. Chavez fell in with the Vicente Silva gang, also known as the Las Garras Blancas. Notorious for mob-style violence, fence-cutting, and vigilante justice, that blurred into outright crime. In 1893, Chavez betrayed Silva himself, shooting and killing him in a dispute over power. Arrested for murder, he was convicted and sentenced to hang. Iron bars might have closed the story, but Chavez refused to end in shadow. While in prison, he helped suppress a riot, saving guards and prisoners alike. The act earned him clemency. His death sentence was commuted to life, and in 1909, Governor Miguel Otero paroled him. Chavez settled near Milagro, New Mexico, living out his final years quietly, farming and ranching. He died on July 17, 1924. His grave, a reminder of a man who lived through the worst chaos of frontier New Mexico and outlasted nearly all who had fought beside him. Jose Chavez y Chavez's life defies simple categories. He was a lawman, elected constable, charged with upholding peace. He was a regulator, firing his gun in defense of Tunstall's case. He was an outlaw, standing with Silva's gang in Las Vegas. He was a killer and a survivor who escaped death sentences and mob justice alike. And always, he was a man of New Mexico, Apache and Spanish, straddling identities in a world where prejudice, monopoly, and violence left few pure choices. And that brings us to Robert or Bob Windeman. The charge? A man who straddled both sides of the law, a deputy U.S. Marshal who rode with outlaws, a literate son of privilege who bled in the dust of Lincoln County. Bob Windeman's life was never just about gunfights. It was about the strange overlap of power, loyalty, and survival on the American frontier. Born on January 24th, 1852 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Windeman was no ordinary frontier drifter. His father, Carl August Windeman, served as the Bavarian consul, giving Bob a childhood colored by diplomacy and transatlantic ties. Educated in Germany as a teenager, fluent, literate, and worldly, he returned to America in 1871 with the polish of European schooling, but the relentless heart of a cowboy. In 1877, that restlessness carried him west. He stepped off into Lincoln County, New Mexico, a land already simmering with monopoly and resentment. There he found work with John Chisholm, and more importantly, he forged a bond with John Henry Tunstall, the young English rancher whose fight against Murphy at Dolan's house would soon engulf the region in war. Unlike most men who would become regulators, Windeman carried a badge. John Sherman Jr., U.S. Marshal for New Mexico, appointed him deputy marshal. It gave Windeman something rare in Lincoln County, a claim to federal authority. When John Tunstall was gunned down on February 18, 1878, Windeman was in the saddle, riding alongside Billy the Kid, Dick Brewer, and the others. He survived the ambush that left Tunstall dead in the dirt, a moment that changed the course of his life. 2 days later, Windeman flexed his authority. When Sheriff Brady jailed Billy and several of the Tunstall men, Windeman and a detachment of soldiers turned the tables, arresting Brady's guards and releasing the regulators. For a moment, federal law seemed to stand against Murphy and Dolan's monopoly, but Governor Samuel B. Axtell, swayed by the Santa Fe Ring allies, revoked Windeman's commission on March 9th. Marshal Sherman reinstated him soon after, but the damage was done. Windeman was marked as both outlaw and officer, trusted by neither side completely. Windeman's role in the bloodletting of 1878 remains controversial. On April 1st, when Sheriff Brady and Deputy Hinman were ambushed in Lincoln, Windeman claimed innocence, saying that he had been feeding Tunstall's dog at the time. Yet when captured afterward, he was armed with 2 pistols and a rifle. Many believe he was part of the execution squad, though no conviction stuck. He rode in regulator companies, took part in arrests that blurred into executions, and evaded multiple indictments. At times, he signed documents and wore a badge proudly. At others, he moved like a gunman in the shadows. Windeman was arrested, released, arrested again, bouncing between military custody at Fort Stanton and civil courts in Mesilla. Each time, charges slipped away. Like the regulators themselves, his warrants increasingly came out the barrel of a gun. But July 1878, as the 5-day battle burned McSween's house to the ground, Windeman saw the writing on the wall. He left Lincoln for Mesilla, testified against Jesse Evans, and then slipped away, eastbound, far from the killing grounds. In London, he visited John Tunstall's father, bearing witness to the loyalty that he had carried for his slain friend. Then he settled in Haverstraw, New York, married Albertine Salyer Limke, raised 4 children, and built a quieter life. He even tried his hand at politics, running for Congress in 1896, though unsuccessfully. Windeman lived until April the 13th, 1930, buried in Mount Repose Cemetery, far from the dust and the gun smoke of Lincoln. He outlived Billy the Kid by half a century, long enough to watch his youthful companions turned into legends. His story lingers because it doesn't fit neatly into legends boxes. He was a deputy marshal who carried federal commissions into the bloodiest feud in New Mexico. He was a regulator who rode with Billy the Kid but claimed detachment from outright murder. He was a loyal friend who risked his life for John Tunstall, and he was a survivor who outlasted the war, the trials, and the myths. And that brings us to Vicente Romero. The charge? A rancher, husband, father, drawn from his home and family into a war not of his making. Vicente Romero rode not for fame or fortune, but for justice, and paid for it with his life. Vicente Romero was born in 1832 in Bernalillo, in the fertile lands north of Albuquerque, part of a long-standing Hispanic ranching family whose roots went back generations under Spanish and Mexican rule. Like so many Hispano settlers, he grew up in a world defined by the land, sheep in the hills, cattle on the range, Aquinas carrying water through parched soil. He spoke Spanish at home, learned English in fragments, and married Marina Romero, raising children on his small holding along the Rio Hondo in Lincoln County. Romero's life was not extraordinary by frontier standards. Long days of labor, tending stock, repairing fences, riding herd, but it was grounded in family and community. He represented the deep Hispanic presence in Lincoln County, a presence often overshadowed by louder names of Murphy, Dolan, Tunstall, and Billy the Kid. By the late 1870s, Lincoln County was a tinderbox. The arrival of John Tunstall and Alexander McSween, the stranglehold of Murphy Dolan's house, and the unchecked violence of hired guns made neutrality almost impossible. When Tunstall was ambushed and murdered, Romero joined the ranks of the Lincoln County Regulators. His role was not as a famed gunfighter, but as what contemporaries called a minor regulator, a local man who provided reinforcement, knowledge of the land, and the loyalty when regulators faced overwhelming odds. He rode beside both Anglos and Hispanos, Billy the Kid, Chavez y Chavez, Yginio Salazar, Francisco Zamora, and Jim French. In this war, Romero became one of many Hispano settlers who decided that the monopoly and its lawmen had taken too much. July 1878 brought the climax. McSween's house in Lincoln was surrounded by Dolan's men, reinforced by soldiers and gangs like the Seven Rivers Warriors. For 5 days, bullets riddled the adobe walls. Fires set roofs ablaze, and women and children huddled inside as the regulators fought for their lives. Vincent Romero was there, trapped in the inferno alongside Billy the Kid, Jim French, Chavez y Chavez, Yginio Salazar, Francisco Zamora, and all the others. When the flames consumed the house on July 19th, the regulators made a desperate run for freedom. Smoke, gunfire, and chaos filled the streets. Romero was cut down in the attempt. Shot 3 times, he fell during the breakout. One of several Hispanic regulators who died or were maimed in those final moments. His death underscored a truth often lost in the retelling. The Lincoln County War was not only an Anglo feud, it was fought and bled by the Hispanic families who lived there, whose sons stood alongside the Anglos in both loyalty and in loss. Vincent Romero's name never grew as large as Billy the Kid's, nor as infamous as Dolan's or Murphy's, but his death mattered. It reminded Lincoln County that this conflict scarred entire communities, not just imported factions or foreign-born merchants. His widow and children continued ranching along the Hondo, their surname etched in the county records, long after the gunfight faded. Today, Romero is remembered as one of the forgotten fighters, a husband, a father who took up arms because the violence left him no other choice. Vincent Romero stands as a testament to the Hispano backbone of the regulators, men who carried both family honor and frontier justice into battle, and who, like Romero, paid with their lives for a war that promised little and took everything. Next is Ignacio Gonzalez. The charge? A cowboy in the shadow of history. Yginio Gonzalez never became a headline name like Billy the Kid, but his rifle barked in the same battles and his blood was spilled in the same war. Almost nothing survives of Yginio Gonzalez's early years. No family Bible records, no photographs, just his name in rosters and witness accounts of the Lincoln County War. What little we know suggests that he was a local Hispano vaquero, working as a cowboy in the Rio Hondo Valley. Like so many others, Vincent Romero, Francisco Zamora, Yginio Salazar, Gonzalez's ties to the land and the daily struggles of ranch life pulled him into a conflict that reached far beyond his household. When John Tunstall was murdered, Yginio threw in his lot with the Regulators. To the young Hispano ranch hands, Tunstall's promise of fair prices and honest credit were more than business. They were survival. Gonzalez picked up a rifle, saddled his horse, and rode under the Regulator banner. Yginio Gonzalez's name surfaces during the bloodiest months of the feud. He fought shoulder to shoulder with Billy the Kid, the Coe cousins, Doc Scurlock, Jim French, and Charlie Bowdry, one of the many young men willing to risk everything in the name of loyalty and vengeance. He was at the 5-day battle, and Gonzalez was one of the defenders trapped in the McSween house. With bullets chewing through the adobe and flames rolling across the roof, Gonzalez held his position as Dolan's men and Colonel Dudley's soldiers closed in. On the night of July 19th, when the Regulators made their desperate break from the inferno, Gonzalez was hit in the right arm by a bullet. He managed to stagger clear, wounded but alive, a survivor where others, including McSween and Vicente Romero, fell. In August of 1878, during the Mescalero Agency skirmish, so weeks after Lincoln burned, Gonzalez was counted among 19 Regulators who rode out toward the Mescalero Apache Agency. Splitting off from Fernando Herrera and Antimacio Martinez, Gonzalez found himself in a firefight with an Apache hunting party, a chaotic clash that underscored how fragile peace remained in the territory. Beyond these mentions, the record falls silent. Gonzalez fades from history, his later years untraced. Like many minor Regulators, his story was swallowed up by the louder legends of Billy the Kid and the frontier mythmakers. Yginio Gonzalez's name survives as a reminder. The Lincoln County War was never just the tale of outlaws and cattle kings. It was fought in the sweat, wounds, and deaths of ordinary Hispano ranch hands who stood their ground when monopoly and corruption closed in. Gonzalez never wrote memoirs. He never lived to see himself turned into a dime novel legend. But his place in the rosters, his scar from the 5-day battle, and his fleeting role in the fight for Lincoln mark him as one of the forgotten men whose lives carried the weight of the frontier violence. Yginio Gonzalez, shot, scarred, and nearly erased, still stands in the long line of men who gave flesh and blood to the Lincoln County War. Next, we have Francisco Zamora, whose name doesn't fill dime novels, nor has his face survived in faded photographs, but in the smoke and gunfire of the Lincoln County War, his courage and his death were written in blood across the adobe walls of McSween's house. Like so many New Mexican vaqueros, Francisco Zamora's early life remains hidden in the folds of forgotten census records and oral tradition. What is certain is that he was a local Hispano ranch hand, raised in the Rio Hondo and Lincoln valleys, bound to the land and its cattle trails long before outsiders like John Tunstall or James Dolan turned the county into a battlefield. When Tunstall was murdered, Zamora, like Vicente Romero, Yginio Salazar, and Yginio Gonzalez, sided with the English ranchers' allies. For Zamora and other Spanish-speaking ranchers, the house meant debt, unfair prices, and intimidation. Joining the Regulators was not just about loyalty to Tunstall. It was about standing up against monopoly that threatened their very survival. By July of 1878, Francisco Zamora found himself barricaded inside Alexander McSween's adobe home in Lincoln. With him were some of the most storied figures of the war: Billy the Kid, Jim French, Chavez y Chavez, Salazar, Romero, and all the others. Outside, Dolan's men, joined by Sheriff George Pepin's posse and supported by Colonel Dudley's soldiers, tightened the noose. For 5 days, Zamora and his companions endured constant fire. The hiss of bullets through adobe and the slow, choking smoke as the house was set ablaze on July 19th. As flames rolled across the roof and the walls collapsed, the trapped Regulators made their desperate bid for escape. Zamora was cut down in the attempt, hit 8 times in the withering crossfire. He died in the street alongside Vicente Romero, another Hispano Regulator who had staked his life on the cause. Only Yginio Salazar, though grievously wounded, survived to crawl away into the night. Francisco Zamora never lived to see the end of the war. His body, riddled with bullets, was one more sacrifice in a feud that pitted small ranchers and cowboys against monopolists with courts, sheriffs, and soldiers on their side. Zamora's story reminds us that the Regulators were never just Anglo drifters or legendary gunfighters. They were also local Hispanos, men rooted in New Mexico's soil who fought and died in defense of their communities. Though history often calls him a forgotten man, his death inside McSween's burning yard speaks louder than myth. He was one of the martyrs of the Lincoln County War, a cowboy who died for loyalty and justice in a world where both were in short supply. Next is John Scroggins. John Scroggins' name doesn't carry the weight of Billy the Kid, nor the tragic drama of Dick Brewer or Frank McNabb. But his presence in the ranks of the Regulators is a reminder of how many local cowboys, often nameless in history's pages, took up arms in the bloody storm that consumed Lincoln County. Very little is preserved about Scroggins' early life. Like many young men who gravitated toward Lincoln County in the 1870s, he was most certainly a ranch hand and cowboy, hardened by cattle trails and the ceaseless demands of frontier work. What is clear is that when the war ignited, Scroggins was among those who answered the call to ride with the Regulators, another minor regulator, but still a man who risked his life alongside everyone else. Scroggins' name enters the record at one of the war's most notorious gunfights, Blazer's Mill, on April the 4th of 78. There, the band of Regulators, Billy, Dick Brewer, Doc Scurlock, John Middleton, confronted the aging but deadly Buckshot Roberts. In the chaos of that shootout, Brewer was killed, several Regulators were wounded, and Roberts, though mortally shot, held off the posse with grim determination. Scroggins fought in the deadly exchange, placing him in the thick of the violence that defined the Regulators' struggle. His name appears again in the indictments that followed, charged with murder for Blazer's Mill alongside his comrades, a mark that shows that he was more than a hanger-on. He was legally recognized as one of the band, a man whose gunfire carried weight in the eyes of the law. What became of John Scroggins after Blazer's Mill remains unclear. Some accounts place him still in Lincoln County during later battles, perhaps even present during the 5-day battle in July, but official records grow silent. Like many of the forgotten Regulators, Scroggins seems to have drifted into obscurity once the dust settled, whether back to cowboying, to Texas, or simply into the anonymity of frontier life. John Scroggins represents the countless young men drawn into the Lincoln County War by loyalty, circumstance, or irresistible pull of survival. He wasn't a leader or a legend, but he was there, in the firestorm of Blazer's Mill, standing shoulder to shoulder with men whose names would echo across history. His legacy is that of the forgotten gun, a reminder that behind every famous outlaw or lawman were riders like Scroggins, brave, often nameless, and essential to the story of the West's most infamous feud. And this next one, he just has a freaking cool name. Roscoe Rustling Bob Bryant.
You just throw him in there because of his name.
Yeah, absolutely. Roscoe Rustling Bob Bryant's name never rose to the heights of Billy the Kid or John Kinney, yet his violent career and bloody end capture the shifting loyalties, outlaw bravado, and chaos of the Lincoln County War. Very little is known about Bryant's origins. His first appearance in the annals of New Mexico history ties him to the John Kinney Gang, one of the territory's most notorious outlaw outfits. The Kinney boys made their reputation in the 1870s through cattle rustling, robbery, and hired gun work, drifting between the roles of gangsters and deputized enforcers depending on who was paying. Bryant earned his moniker, Rustling Bob, through a reputation for livestock theft, a trade that was as much economic sabotage as it was survival in a land where cattle meant power. He was never part of the Regulator inner circle, but in the blurred lines of 1878, he rode with them nonetheless. A gunman whose presence was felt in the storm of blood and smoke that defined the feud. Bryant's time in the war was marked by opportunism and violence. He was seen in cattle raids, joining gangs and Regulator allies to seize or recover stock in the conflict between Murphy Dolan's monopoly and the Tunstall McSween faction. He fought during the 5-day battle in Lincoln in July of 78, when McSween's house was besieged, burned, and stormed. Bryant, like Billy the Kid, Jim French, Tom O'Fallard, and other fighters, survived the desperate breakout through the smoke and the bullets. Later, Bryant associated with Selman Scouts, another volatile band of enforcers and wrestlers whose loyalties shifted with contracts, bribes, and survival instincts. Bryant embodied the era's fluid alliances, one day a regulator, another day an outlaw working with men who might just as easily turn their guns on him. In September of 1878, Bryant's outlaw path ended the way that it had always seemed destined, in blood and betrayal. Near Seven Rivers, New Mexico, he was killed, most likely by Selman Scouts themselves. His body was discovered alongside Reese Golby and James Irvin, also believed to have been gunned down in the same wave of retribution. The message was clear. In Lincoln County, loyalty was temporary, and even the hardiest riders could be cut down without warning. Roscoe Rustling Bob Bryant remains one of the many forgotten men of the Lincoln County War. Those Rough Riders who shifted between factions, lived hard, and died young. His presence reminds us that the conflict was not just about legends like Billy the Kid, but also dozens of lesser-known cowboys and wrestlers whose choices fueled the violence. Bryant's life and death symbolize the brutal churn of the frontier, where an outlaw could be a regulator 1 month and a corpse the next. Next is Tom Peterson. Tom Peterson's name rarely surfaces in the gunsmoke and the fire of the Lincoln County War, yet his presence reminds us that this bloody feud was fought not only by legends, but also by dozens of unknown cowboys drawn into the maelstrom. Little survives of Peterson's early life. Unlike the ironclad regulators whose deeds filled the papers and the court records, Peterson's story is thin, tucked into rosters and lists preserved by historians. What we do know is that he was a cowboy, one of the many ranch hands in Lincoln County caught between monopoly and survival. After the murder of Tunstall, men like Peterson were faced with a choice: stand idle under Murphy Dolan's monopoly, or ride with those demanding justice. Peterson chose the latter, falling in with the Regulators, a band that began as a deputized posse and ended as a vigilante army. Peterson was not among the famous shooters at Blazer's Mill or the dramatic ambush that killed Sheriff Brady, nor is his name attached to the fiery last stand at the McSween house. Instead, he is listed among the, quote, additional documented members. Men who swelled the Regulators' ranks in the long weeks between ambushes and sieges. His role was likely that of a scout, rider, and a gun in the background, helping guard horses, track cattle, and hold the line when the numbers meant survival. For every iconic figure like Billy the Kid or Doc Scurlock, there were a dozen men like Tom Peterson, armed, committed, but anonymous in the greater telling of the war. Tom Peterson's story is the story of the forgotten fighters. No dime novel was written about him, no ballad sung. He left no trial transcript, no obituary in distant newspapers, yet he stood shoulder to shoulder with the men who would become legends, sharing their dangers, if not their fame. His quiet inclusion in Regulator rosters is more than a footnote. It is proof that the Lincoln County War was not just a clash of giants, but a communal struggle that swept up ordinary cowboys, Hispano ranchers, and local boys looking for justice or simply protection. Tom Peterson fades into the background of history, but his saddle print remains alongside the rest, a reminder that legends are built not only by the names we remember, but by those that we forgot. Which brings us to another one with a freaking cool name, and that is Tiger Sam Smith.
There you go.
Tiger Sam Smith, sometimes remembered under the name Fred Wyatt, was not a legend like Billy the Kid, but a tough cowboy who stood in the smoke and the fury of the Lincoln County War's bloodiest days. His story shows how fast an ordinary ranch hand could be pulled into an extraordinary violence, only to meet an equally violent end. Smith stepped into the storm immediately after Tunstall's murder. On February 19th, he sat at the coroner's jury investigating Tunstall's killing, placing himself squarely against Sheriff William Brady and the Murphy-Dolan faction. His defiance earned him an early arrest, one of many young men jailed for daring to question Brady's authority. Released soon after, Smith took up arms with the newly formed Regulators. On March 9, 1878, Smith rode with some of the most hardened men of the frontier. Billy the Kid, Dick Brewer, Charlie Bowdry, the whole bunch, tracking William Morton and Frank Baker, the gunman accused of murdering Tunstall. Along the road near Blackwater Creek, the prisoners and their escort did not make it back alive. Morton, Baker, and McCloskey all ended up dead, and Tiger Sam was counted among the shooters. This episode marked the hard turn of the Regulators, from lawful posse to vigilantes. For Smith, it was both the height of his notoriety and the beginning of his disappearance from Lincoln County. Soon after Blackwater, he left the war behind, riding east into Texas and then down into Pecos country. Back in Texas and southeastern New Mexico, Smith returned to the trade that he knew best, cattle. By 1882, he had married Julia Purley Ward, and together they raised 7 children. Among neighbors and fellow hands, Smith gained a reputation as one of the toughest cowboys around, hard riding, hard shooting, and loyal to his kin. But the frontier gave no guarantees. In April of 1880, while working cattle on the harsh flats south of Lincoln, Smith crossed paths with a band of Apache warriors. Outnumbered and exposed, he was cut down in the skirmish. He died, as many of his generation did, by violence under the wide New Mexican sky. Tiger Sam Smith's life is a blueprint of the forgotten Regulator. A cowboy swept into the violence of the Lincoln County War, a gun in the shadows of Blackwater, a man who walked away before the final infernos of Lincoln but could not escape the brutality of the frontier. He left behind a family, a reputation for toughness, and a name, half remembered, half lost, that still rides the margins of history. His story is proof that the Lincoln County War was not only about the great players and the legends, but also men like Smith, ordinary hands who found themselves drawn into extraordinary gunfights and who carried the scars or the fatal price long after the smoke cleared. Next, we have Matt Steinmuller. Matt Steinmuller is one of those names that survives only because it was scribbled into a roster. His life is mostly a blank page, but even blank pages matter in the story of the Lincoln County War. He was there, he carried a rifle, and he rode beneath the Regulators' banner when justice and vengeance blurred into one. Almost nothing is known about Steinmüller's early years. His surname suggests German heritage, and it's likely that he was an immigrant or a first-generation American working as a cowboy, drifter, or a local ranch hand in the Lincoln County area. He was not part of the ironclad circle, men like Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, or the Coe cousins, but his inclusion in reliable rosters shows that he was present during the violence of 1878. The lack of detail about his past reflects a reality of frontier history. Not every man who strapped on a gun and rode into battle left behind a memoir, a newspaper obituary, or a family lineage to carry the table. Steinmüller belongs to that wide class of cowboys whose presence mattered, but whose stories slipped into silence after the gun smoke cleared. Steinmüller joined the Regulators after the murder of Tunstall, and by then the group had swollen beyond its small inner circle. For every ironclad gunfighter, there were several lesser-known riders, men like Steinmüller, who provided the extra rifles that kept the fight going. While not recorded at the ambush of Sheriff Brady, the Buckshot Roberts fight at Blazer's Mill, or the fiery 5-day battle, Steinmüller's name survives among the documented Regulators, listed in contemporary accounts and later research. His role was probably that of a support rider, scout, a lookout, or a rear guard, helping to swell the ranks when the Regulators needed to show force against Murphy Dolan's hired guns and corrupt deputies. It's easy to imagine him on the edge of a skirmish, rifle braced across the saddle, scanning the mesquite flats for dust clouds that meant an approaching posse, or standing guard in a ranch house while the ironclads debated their next move. Matt Steinmüller's story is not about headline-making gunfights or famous last words. It's about the forgotten men, the dozens of cowboys and day hands who drifted into the conflict, fought briefly under the Regulator banner, and then drifted out again. His obscurity reinforces the truth. The Lincoln County War was never just a duel between a handful of famous names. It was a community conflict, and men like Steinmüller were part of its fabric. Without them, the Regulators would have been little more than a handful of hot-headed kids with pistols. With them, they became an army, briefly capable of challenging one of the most entrenched monopolies in the New Mexico Territory. Steinmüller's life and fate remain unknown, but his name, surviving on rosters over a century later, reminds us that even the quietest gunman carried weight in the Old West bloodiest feuds. And then, interestingly enough, the next one does appear in Young Guns as one of the main characters in the show, but ironically, he's listed as one of the minor Regulators. So I think it's just because his name, honestly.
Oh, okay.
And that being Dirty Steve Stevens. Dirty Steve Stevens is one of those names that lingers on the margins of history, recorded on rosters, mentioned by comrades, and tied forever to a single bloody day at Blazer's Mill. Beyond that, he is a ghost. No known birthplace, no family name that carries on, just a half-remembered cowboy who rode with Regulators, fought with them, and then vanished back into the dust until he shows up in like a major motion picture.
You're not salty at all.
It's just funny as shit to me. It's like, if you had a really cool name back then, you had a chance to be in Young Guns.
I'm sure that's what they were thinking.
I think it had to have.
We will be immortalized forever if we have cool names.
Oh, what they were thinking.
Yeah.
I'm sure so too. So Stevens surfaces in history on April 4th, 1878 at the gunfight at Blazer's Mill, the most violent and chaotic firefight of the Lincoln County War, alongside men like Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, John Middleton, Charlie Bowdry, Jim French. Stevens was part of the squad of Regulators who cornered the lone, battle-hardened gunman Buckshot Roberts. The confrontation spiraled out of control. Roberts, a veteran fighter, refused to surrender and fought from the doorway of the mill like a man possessed. When the smoke cleared, Regulator leader Dick Brewer lay dead. Middleton and the others were wounded, and Roberts himself was mortally injured. Stevens' presence at this fight is the only confirmed action, but it was no minor skirmish. It was a turning point. By standing shoulder to shoulder with the core Regulators in this battle, Stevens demonstrated that he was more than a hanger-on. He was one of the men trusted to bring a gun into the line of fire when it mattered most. What became of Stevens after Blazer's Mill remains a mystery. He did not appear on indictments for Brady's assassination, nor was he listed among the men holed up at McSween's house during the 5-day battle. Unlike Jim French or Fred Waite, his name never reappeared in reminiscence decades later. Some historians believe that he may have simply drifted out of Lincoln County after Blazer's Mill, returning to Texas or further west into obscurity. Others speculate that he might have died in some nameless skirmish, his story swallowed by the borderless violence of the frontier. What sets Stevens apart is not what we know, but what we don't. He was there, armed, committed, and willing to risk his life for the Regulators, but he left behind no memoirs, no descendants with tales to tell, no colorful legends to feed dime novels. Instead, his memory lingers in lists. The roll call of the Regulators, preserved by historians who worked backward through scraps of testimony and courthouse records. In that way, Dirty Steve embodies the forgotten backbone of the Lincoln County War, the cowboys and ranch hands whose names were barely remembered, but without whom the fight could never have been waged. Modern audiences know Dirty Steve mainly through the 1988 film Young Guns, where the character was transformed into a comic, unwashed sidekick, a far cry from the shadowy figure who fought at Blazer's Mill. The movie cemented his name in popular imagination, but the real Stevens remains unknowable, tethered only to that violent day in 1878. Dirty Steve Stevens was real. Even if history has reduced him to a ghost, he was a Regulator, a fighter at Blazer's Mill, and one of the men who threw his lot in with Billy the Kid's company during the bloodiest feud in New Mexico. His anonymity is the story, proof that the Lincoln County War was not just fought by legends, but by countless nameless, forgotten cowboys who shouldered rifles, faced death, and disappeared into silence. Next is Hayika Hayik Aninia. Hayika Hayik Aninia is one of those names that drifts through the rosters of the Lincoln County Regulators, listed by contemporaries, preserved by historians, but left without a story to fill the gaps. What survives is simple but telling. He was there. He threw in with Billy the Kid's company during 1878, rode under the Regulator banner, and added his rifle to one of the bloodiest chapters in the West. Aninia's name appears in documented Regulator rolls, including rosters compiled by the White Oaks Archives and later confirmed by historians. He was not part of the ironclad circle of leaders, men like Brewer, Skurlock, or Bowdry, but instead among the larger body of cowboys and ranch hands who were drawn into the fight. His presence demonstrates how the Regulators were not a fixed, exclusive band, but rather a fluid, diverse company that swelled and shifted as the conflict deepened. Like so many others, Aninia joined after John Tunstall's murder in February of '78, when anger boiled over into organized resistance. His role was that of a documented fighter, a man who rode alongside better-known names in pursuit of justice or vengeance against Murphy and Dolan's faction. No surviving testimony places Aninia at the most infamous firefights, the Brady ambush, Blazer's Mill, or the burning of the McSween house. But his inclusion in authentic rosters confirms that he participated in the Regulators' broader campaigns of skirmishes, raids, and armed defense during those chaotic months. Men like Hayik Yginio were essential in ways the records rarely capture. They filled out posses, watched the back trails, served as scouts, and bolstered the numbers that gave the Regulators their fighting strength. Without these additional men, the Regulators would have been too few to challenge Murphy Dolan's hired guns. Yginio is a reminder that the Lincoln County War was not just fought by the legends whose names became folklore. It was also fought by cowboys and ranchers whose stories were barely recorded. His name, preserved in rosters and remembered by historians, ensures that he remains part of the narrative, one of the forgotten fighters of the Regulators, proof of how broad and complicated this struggle really was. And then we've got Fernando Herrera, Antonio Martinez, and the forgotten Hispanic Regulators. So Fernando Herrera was a respected Hispano rancher and marksman from San Patricio, tied deeply into the Spanish-speaking communities that formed the backbone of Lincoln County. He became father-in-law to Doc Scurlock, binding him by kinship to one of the Regulator leaders. Locals remembered him not only as a cattleman, but as a steadying figure who lent credibility to the largely Anglo-led movement against Murphy and Dolan. Herrera did not ride as one of the ironclad Regulators, but he raised a contingent of about 25 Hispano fighters. Neighbors and kin from San Patricio and Pacacao, who acted as auxiliary allies to Tunstall's men. His famous contribution came during the 5-day battle in July of 78. From the rear of the Montana house, Herrera leveled a Sharps rifle and, with legendary precision, killed Charlie Crawford, a Murphy Dolan enforcer and member of the Seven Rivers Warriors, at an estimated distance of more than 500 yards. Absolutely not the way that Charlie Crawford died in the movie. Anyway, for the record. So unlike many of his contemporaries, Herrera survived the conflict, returned to his ranching life, and lived long enough to see the myths of Billy the Kid and the Regulators take root. He died in Alamogordo in the 1930s, remembered by descendants as both a fighter and a patriarch. Then we have Antonio Martinez. Antonio Martinez was a Spanish-speaking constable in Lincoln County in early 1878. Trusted by Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson, Martinez represented the link between Hispanic civic authority and the young Anglo ranchers who sought justice after Tunstall's murder. On February 20th, 1878, just a day after Tunstall's funeral, Martinez received warrants from Judge Wilson for the arrest of Tunstall's killers. To execute them, he deputized Billy the Kid and Fred Waite, an act that legally placed the future Regulators under sworn authority. Sheriff William Brady and his deputies immediately undermined this authority, disarming and humiliating Martinez, Bonnie, and Waite at the Murphy store before detaining them for hours. This early clash illustrated the corruption that fueled the war. Lawful deputies arrested by the very sheriff sworn to uphold their work. Martinez continued to ride with the Regulators, sometimes splitting off with Herrera's Hispanic contingent, and joined them in actions at the Mescalero Agency and beyond. Martinez survived the conflict, returning to civil life in Lincoln County. While he faded from the headlines, his role as the man who first placed Billy the Kid under legal oath remains one of the most striking moments of irony in the war's tangled history. While men like Herrera and Martinez are documented in detail, dozens of other Hispanic cowboys and villagers also took up arms. Their stories, though fragmentary, remind us that the Regulators were not solely an Anglo affair. Jose Maria Sanchez, remembered in rosters as a local rider who joined temporarily for raids and for scouting. Martin Chavez, led a small group of Hispanic fighters who supported the Regulators during the 5-day battle, but soon returned to ranch life. Unnamed villagers from San Patricio and Caco provided food, shelter, marksmanship, and intelligence, often risking their homes and families to side with McSween's faction. The Hispanic Regulators, Herrera, Martinez, Zamora, Romero, Gonzalez, Salazar, and countless unnamed ranch hands, embodied the often overlooked diversity of the Lincoln County War. For them, the conflict was not just about loyalty to Tunstall or McSween, but about resisting a monopoly that threatened their land, their livelihoods, and their families. Their contributions were indispensable. Herrera's rifle fire changed the tide in battle. Martinez gave Billy the Kid his first legal badge, and others died beside their Anglo comrades in the smoke and the blood of Lincoln streets. And then completing the roster, we have Jose Maria Sanchez, which we already mentioned, Martin Chavez, Fernando Herrera's San Patricio auxiliaries, and so beyond just himself, several local men's names, often fragmentary, appear in oral tradition as part of his 25-man support group. These include distant kin of Herrera and extended family from San Patricio and Bacaco. These men manned sharpshooter positions and helped cover Regulators' escapes. Most faded back into the village anonymity after the war, leaving Herrera as the sole remembered figure. When Martinez first deputized Billy the Kid and Fred Waite under John B. Wilson, other Hispanic cowboys were briefly sworn in for the same task. Their names are lost to time, but records suggest that Martinez commanded a small Spanish-speaking posse alongside the emerging Regulators before Sheriff Brady forcibly disarmed them. Beyond the better documented figures, McCloskey, Romero, Gonzalez, and the whole bunch, rosters occasionally list additional Regulators without details. These include Jose Chavez, which is distinct from Jose Chavez y Chavez, probably a local Hispanic ranch hand, unnamed San Patricio riders, often grouped under Herrera's auxiliaries, and transient cowboys who joined for single raids and then disappeared from the historical record. These forgotten men underscore a crucial truth. The Regulators were not a fixed band of a dozen legendary fighters. They were a shifting coalition, sometimes swelling to 40 or more, blending Anglos, Hispanos, ranchers, cowboys, constables, and outlaws. Some, like Yginio Salazar, lived to old age and left oral histories. Others, like Francisco Zamora and Vicente Romero, died in the fire and the smoke of the McSween house. Many more, like Tom Peterson or Yginio, are remembered only because their names were written into a roster before they vanished into obscurity. Together, they remind us that the Lincoln County War was not just fought by Billy the Kid and his famous companions. It was a community-wide conflict, and these lesser-known Regulators paid the same price of blood, fear, and survival. The testimony of the Regulators has been entered into the record. One by one, we've heard their stories: foremen and farmhands, poets and drifters, cousins and comrades. Some wore the badge in later years, some wore chains, and others never escaped the desert winds that carried them to an unmarked grave. Individually, their verdicts are as varied as the men themselves, but as a group, their story converges on a single point in time. They were not born vigilantes. They were not scheming outlaws. They were cowboys, ranch hands, and hired men who might have lived quiet lives had history allowed it. What bound them together was the cold-blooded murder of John Henry Tunstall, a killing carried out in broad daylight under the color of law. That single shot did more than take a life. It stripped away the illusion that Lincoln County's courts or sheriffs could ever protect them. Faced with a system already bent by monopoly and bribery, they took the only path left open. They became regulators, deputized for a moment, cast out as outlaws the next. They crossed a line that men in the West crossed all too often, from legal constables to vigilantes. Some embraced it, others carried the burden to their dying day, but all of them were forced into a trial where the law itself was the first casualty. In the years that followed, their paths scattered. Henry Newton Brown died at the end of a lynch rope. Fred Waite returned to the Chickasaw Nation and lived as a statesman. George Coe survived the war, his eyesight lost to the gunfire, but his voice preserved in memoir. Billy the Kid became legend. Yginio Salazar carried his scars in silence. Some sank deeper into outlawry. Others climbed back toward respectability. The war branded them all, but it did not define each of them forever. And so, we withhold judgment on these men as individuals. We withhold judgment on the war itself, who was right and who was wrong, whether the House or the McSween faction carried the greater guilt. The case is still before the court, and its arguments remain unfinished. But the verdict of time on the Regulators as a group is this. They had little choice. In a country where the badge was bought and justice corrupted, vigilante justice was often the only justice left. They were not saints, nor were they devils, but men driven by circumstance into a role history remembers more starkly than they might have chosen for themselves. The Regulators have stepped down from the stand. Their testimony is complete. What began as a ranch crew became a vigilante company, bound by the murder of John Tunstall and set adrift when the law itself abandoned them. We'll reserve judgment on the Lincoln County War, on who was right, who was wrong, and whether justice ever truly existed in Lincoln at all. That trial is still before us. But for now, the record shows that the Regulators were men caught in a crucible, pressed into chaos most never sought. And history has marked them, not as individuals alone, but as a brotherhood forged in blood. The Regulators' record is entered. Their testimony rests, but no trial is complete without hearing from the other side. Waiting beyond these walls is the House, the monopoly of Murphy, Dolan, and Riley, backed by the Santa Fe Ring and the power of corrupted courts. They held the deeds, the ledgers, and the badges that wielded the law not as a shield but as a weapon. If the Regulators were born from the murder of John Tunstall, then the House was the hand that struck first. And in this courtroom of history, their turn on the stand is coming. The Regulators have stepped down from the stand, their testimony complete. From ranch hands to vigilantes, they were bound by the cold-blooded murder of John Tunstall, forced into a war where the law itself had already collapsed.
And while some of them went on to wear badges, others drifted into outlawry, and still others tried to build quieter lives. The truth is, they didn't start this fight. The system left them no choice.
Exactly. The verdict of time on the Regulators as a group is not that they were saints or villains, but men caught in a crucible where vigilante justice was often the only justice available.
But the larger case, the Lincoln County War itself, is still before this court. We've yet to weigh the full record of the House, of Murphy, Dolan, Riley, and the machine behind them. Who was right, who was wrong, and that judgment is still to come.
And when it comes, it will not be simple, because justice in Lincoln County was never simple.
Before we close today's session, don't forget to support the show, follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, so you never miss an episode. Leave us a review. It helps more listeners find their way into this courtroom.
And if you want to take your seat on the jury of history, share this podcast with friends, family, and anyone who loves the truth behind the myths of the Old West. For those who want to go farther, You can support us directly on Patreon, Ko-fi, or Substack. Every contribution keeps the research alive and the lights on in this courtroom of the past.
You can also be part of the work itself through our Adopt a Victim program. You can choose a forgotten case to champion, helping bring long lost voices back to the record. Or, if you have skills to lend, join the Dark Dialogue Collective, our volunteer network of researchers, searchers, and advocates who keep these stories moving forward.
Your support spreads the word, fuels the investigation, and ensures these trials of history are never forgotten. The jury of history never adjourns. Let the past take the stand and the guilty face the gallows.